Okay, so thanks a million for inviting me to talk a bit more about Burren grasslands. So I am currently working as a grassland ecologist with the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So I spend a lot of my time taking a closer look at a range of grasslands. But today we're going to look at the Burren grasslands. I'm going to keep it fairly lightweight. I'm not going to get into too much technical stuff because I want to just have a good, easygoing overview, introduce it to some of the key species, some of the key concepts, nothing too technical. So we'll have a little bit of an overview. What are the main kind of grasslands that are found? I might touch on the soils and the geology. I'm going to definitely touch on the difficulties of mapping grasslands exactly. It's quite tricky, particularly in the Burren. Definitely look at some species, focusing on some plants, some of the Burren specialities, and some late flowering species. What can you get out and see now at this time of the year? Look at a couple of grassland invertebrates and maybe some other animals, and just wrap it up a little bit with what's the conservation status, any threats and issues, and some possible solutions. So that is the plan. So the Burren is very famous, as we know, for its flora and fauna, also for its geology, and of course its cultural heritage, past and present, huge part of the Burren story. But the impressive biodiversity is indebted in no small way to agricultural tradition. So I'll come back to that a couple of times as we go through the talk. So agriculture and the human hand on the Burren is of huge importance to why it's so very biodiverse now. From a natural history point of view, the limestone pavements and the species-rich grasslands are probably the most famous aspects, but also very important, and I won't be getting into it much today, but the hazelwoods, the really well-developed scrub, the heathlands, and the turlocks, all hugely important, and more besides. What's really characteristic of the Burren is the patch-like arrangement, or this mosaic-like arrangement of the vegetation communities. So that'll come up. The Burren is really remarkable in terms of its size. It really is kind of mind-boggling. It's one of the largest limestone pavement-dominated landscapes in Europe, and it's the largest area of limestone pavement itself in Europe at 31,000 hectares of limestone pavement. We like to be able, it doesn't happen that often, to maybe lord it over our neighbours, the UK. They have only about 3,000 hectares and with 31,000 hectares. So really it dwarfs what is found in the UK nearby. And it's easy to forget that the scale of this landscape is so important. So just have a screen grab here from an aerial photograph. Some of you may recognize it. It was taken largely at random, but it's near Slieve Carron. So some of you might know this area. I think it illustrates quite well what I was saying about this patchwork or mosaic of habitats. Intermingled in most places in the Burren, you have patches of maybe this dry calcareous grassland. And that might be a lot of what we can see here on the left of the photograph. But if you were standing in those areas, it might look more like calcareous heath. There's definitely going to be patches of scrub, and for sure there's limestone pavement in there. So it can be really hard to draw maps to outline blocks of habitat. If we look on this image, I'll fairly loosely call them fields. We can see stone walls and fields. Very hard to say that it's all one habitat or another habitat. And yet we know that there's huge amounts of calcareous grassland in the Burren. Really difficult to put some figures on it. And I'll just show you something quickly from some work that was done in 2006. Sharon Parr, Grace O'Donovan and John Finn, using kind of remote technology, figured that there was about 30% unimproved grassland across the Burren, but 28% improved grassland. So that's been improved for agriculture. Maybe 20% pavement, that's counting vegetated and unvegetated, about 14% scrub, and about 3% heath. Now look, a number of things have happened since then. Technology has moved on, our understanding and our naming of habitats have moved on, but it gives us an idea of the spread. We still don't have detailed mapping for all of the Burren, but actually Sharon and myself are working on a project whereby we'll get a little bit closer to some of the answers. We'll still be estimating, but just gives us an idea. It's useful to have a rough idea of the breakdown. So the types of grassland that you get in the Burren, and again, I'm keeping this nice and straightforward without getting into too much detail, because that's another day's work. The main grassland type is dry calcareous grassland. So with that description, we mean it's well drained, so not wet, and it has a high pH, or is alkaline. So in other words, it's not acid, it's not peaty. We'll look at some of the characteristic and the special species of this grassland shortly. Other grassland types that occur in the Burren, there's wet grassland for sure, little pockets of it throughout the Burren, but larger areas mainly on the east and the southwest flanks of the Burren. And to the southwest in particular, there are areas of Molinia meadow. It's a particular type of grassland which is of good, really high nature conservation value. It's an annex habitat. I'll explain what that means now shortly. And on the pockets of deeper soil, there might be more nutrients held here, there's certainly more soil depth. You can get stronger or thicker growth of grasses and the flowering herb species. And in these areas, you can get different types of grassland, and you may get another annex grassland type called lowland hay meadow. So just to mention those, but we're going to be focusing on the dry calcareous grassland today and some of its constituent species. So dry calcareous grasslands have a link with a habitat type that's listed for protection on an EU level. So the EU Habitats Directive has a number of annexes, they're like appendices, and they list certain habitat types and species types. On Annex 1, there's a list of habitat types that are rare all across Europe, and there's a type of dry calcareous grassland listed there. So here's the full name. I would say don't worry about it. Here's what we call it. Here's the shorter version: species-rich calcareous grassland, or sometimes orchid-rich calcareous grassland. So there's lots of that in the Burren. It's really the hub for this grassland type in Ireland, even though you do get it in other places as well, but there's a lot of this in the Burren. And these species-rich calcareous grasslands, they're among the most species-rich plant communities in Europe. They're always associated with low-intensity agriculture, so they're farmed, but it's low intensity. It's not very intensive agriculture, it's low intensity. And they're always found on free-draining mineral soils as well. So we'll take a look at some of the characteristic species of these species-rich calcareous grasslands. Now, don't worry, a lot of small text in a big table here. Don't need you to worry about the details at all. But just to bring this up, because if when I have ecologists working, going out assessing or checking the conservation status of these habitats, they take out this list of species. And these are species that are characteristic of the habitat. They're not the only species found there, but they're a good judge. They're a good suite of species to look at. So we have two sets of lists here: the scientific name on the left in each case and the common name on the right. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. Cowslip and orchid down towards the bottom. A lot of you guys would recognize cowslip, and you would know if you saw an orchid. These are species that are characteristic of this habitat type. I've also highlighted spring gentian, so we'll see a photo in a second, really tied to the image of the Burren, and indeed it's an emblem of the Burren, and it's a characteristic species for this habitat type. Bloody cranesbill, again, a really highly visible characteristic species of the Burren, occurs in great abundance here and can be seen at a distance as you move through the habitat. Harebell, another species characteristic, it's in the photograph here. Caroline thistle, I'll mention that later. Other species you might recognize: wild carrot, lady's bedstraw, common birdsfoot trefoil, and wild thyme. Again, just to give you a flavor of the type of species that typically or commonly make up this habitat, species-rich calcareous grassland. So zooming out maybe from that particular habitat, the Burren flora in general. Is it really that special? Let's explore that. Is the Burren flora worth all the fuss and the attention it gets? And look, bit of a spoiler, yeah, it really is. And it's not so much about individual rarities. It's more about the highly unusual plant assemblages. So the way the plants have grouped themselves, so the plants that are found there and how they come together. So let me talk you through some of the examples of this. I suppose one of the main things, one of the key cruxes, is the fact that you have Arctic alpine species. So species that are found either northern latitudes or high up mountains. So these are real tough cookies. They're used to cold temperatures, to maybe snow, to really tough climates. They're found in the Burren, which in itself is already odd. They're found often growing beside species that have more southern distributions or maybe more Mediterranean distributions. So these species are a bit more fragile. They like it a bit warmer, maybe a bit drier. They might not be fragile, maybe they're drought tolerant, but they certainly are associated with very different climatic conditions. So they're both found in the Burren. Each thing is odd, but they're found growing beside each other, which makes it even more perplexing. And also these Arctic alpine species, they're normally, certainly in the alpine situation, found on mountaintops, but they're found growing at sea level in the Burren. So that in itself is highly unusual. We also have woodland species growing in really open areas of limestone pavement that are often devoid of tree cover or canopy cover. That's perplexing at times. We've acid-loving species growing alongside lime-loving species. So species that are typically more common in acid habitats, maybe even peaty soils, often found beside some really characteristic lime-loving or calcareous species. Again, sometimes very old trees, scarcely a foot high out on the limestone pavement. Very perplexing to see what are very gnarled roots and trunks and very small trees. I call them the bonsai trees of the Burren. A very unusual aspect of the Burren flora. And then as well, species that are often scarce or occurring in very low numbers or very low densities otherwise outside of the Burren can occur in great abundances here. So that again is one of the things that's really remarkable about the Burren flora. But why is it so different? What is it that brings all of this together? Well, look, there is no one simple answer. And I'm going to list a couple of things here. It's not even a comprehensive list, but let's look at some of the factors that act together. So the limestone rock, the karst as it's called, has a number of microhabitats, which are actually quite important. At first glance, it can appear quite bare, but there are gripes, the gaps in the limestone rock. These provide shelter and moisture and protection. And that goes some way to explaining maybe why we see woodland species out on the limestone rock or in the gripes in the limestone rock. As well, very importantly, limestone rock acts as a giant storage heater. During the summer, the rock builds up a store of heat, slowly releases that then during the summer. So hard frosts are uncommon. And this is very important in terms of growth and in terms of how many species survive. The soils are very important in the Burren as well. And again, that's a whole other talk in itself. So the soils can be very varied. There's very thin soils in places, and that's important. There's kind of wind-blown derived soils. There's very weathered soils, so soils that may have been rich in minerals, but the minerals have been leached out. The variety of the soils in terms of the depth and their makeup are very important in terms of explaining why different species and unexpected species grow side by side. And one of the very, very important things is the agricultural system in the Burren, the winterage system, as it's called. So transhumance is the seasonal movement of livestock by farmers. It's quite a traditional method. It's still practiced in many countries in Europe. Typically, upland areas are used in the summer and lowland areas in the winter for obvious reasons, for shelter and safety for the animals. But in the Burren, reverse transhumance has been practiced. So the cattle are actually grazed on the rougher uplands between October and April. And this unique system was developed over thousands of years to take maximum advantage of the unique combination of the limestone terrain and its storage heating capacity and the oceanic climate that we have here. And it works amazingly for our flora too. Basically, the animals are out in winter, they're eating through the vegetation that has grown through the summer. They're tramping around, creating little pockets of bare soil. And when springtime comes, the time for germination, it's at the time when the grass and the vegetation is at its most open, at its lowest, loads of space for things to germinate. So it works really well and is a huge explainer for the mix of plants. Also worth considering is the lack of agricultural improvement over a very large landscape scale. Again, the size of the Burren is so important in why it's so special and why so many species have survived there. So the very scale of this, the large area over which agricultural improvement has not happened, means that many species have been able to survive where they've been pushed to extinction. So look, those are some of the reasons. I'm sure there's a few more as well that we could add to that. So let's meet some of these characters. So here is a species that called the dense flowered orchid, Neotinia maculata. This is one of the Mediterranean distribution species. So this species really is quite unusual to find it this far north in the globe. This species is very at home around the Mediterranean. It tends to like warmer, drier climates than we have here. It's a very small species, very inconspicuous. This photo is quite zoomed in. It's quite hard to see. It's only a 10 or 15 centimeter tall plant. This is as showy as the flowers get. They're kind of cream colored and always quite closed in. So this is one of the things that one of the species that people come to the Burren to see, and it can be quite a challenge unless you know where there are good spots for it. Not such a challenge because it's got this amazing bright blue color, and I think this will be familiar to most people. This is spring gentian, Gentiana verna. Also quite a speciality and quite a surprising thing to find here. Many of the gentians, and this one as well, are more at home in kind of alpine situations, so much harsher climates than here. And again, these two are often found growing side by side, not quite the same flowering period, but growing side by side in the Burren. So I'm going to show some distribution maps as I go through some of the species. They're all from the BSBI, Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. And the website is there. Really highly recommend that you check out their website. So many resources, so much to learn, so much to find out if you're anyway interested in botany and you're not already aware of this organization. Anyway, the maps, they're kind of old style maps from the BSBI. There's up-to-date maps and lots of data that you can play around with live. But I use these, they're handy for illustration. So what you have on these maps is blue squares. Each square is a 10-kilometer square, and it means a plant was recorded there. If there's a red square, it means a plant was recorded, but it was introduced. So it was introduced by man rather than occurring naturally. So you can see on the left, the distribution of dense flowered orchid. It's pretty much absent from the UK, and in Ireland, it has a very restricted distribution. So this is a real speciality of the Burren and indeed of Ireland. And on the right-hand side, you can see the spring gentian, the map, and you get the gist there. Again, it's very much a species of the Burren and East Galway, small little cluster of sites in Northern England as well. But again, very much a Burren speciality species. And here's another, Mountain Avens. It's called Dryas octopetala. Octopetala means 8 petals. You can count them there. This is quite a low growing species. You can see it there mixed in with the spring gentian, but it's quite a woody base. And you can see the photo above on the top right shows what the seed heads look like. So it's spectacular even when it's in seed as well. It's kind of whirls of fluffy seed heads to help it disperse. So this again is one of the Arctic alpine species, and when you see it and feel it in real life, it's quite a tough, hardy species, quite different to the others. Quite woody at the base, small waxy leaves, all characteristics that help it survive in a very harsh climate, normally where it's normally found. Here's its distribution in Britain and Ireland. And again, you can see very much a Burren speciality in Ireland, but also found in Fermanagh and Sligo, where we also have limestone uplands. Interestingly, see in Scotland, it's quite widespread, relatively speaking, in Scotland. So it must be, I think, quite at home in the mountains of Scotland. I'm just going to quickly pop up a photo of the dense flowered orchid to remind you that, again, these grow side by side, an Arctic alpine species beside a Mediterranean. Nowhere else in the world can you see these two species growing side by side other than in the Burren. So it's the individual species are interesting, but the mixes are really fascinating. This species is called shrubby cinquefoil. I'm maybe pushing the boundaries of grasslands a little here. This is a species that you found in kind of rocky, grassy habitats around the edges of turlocks, the lakes that come up and down seasonally. Shrubby cinquefoil is also a species of quite limited distribution in Ireland. It may look familiar to you because we have this species and closely related relatives that are often used in gardens. So I have actually two varieties of this in my garden. I've inherited them from the previous owner. The map is quite small now, so you'll have to take my word for it. There's quite limited distribution in Ireland for this. Again, it really is a Burren speciality, a little bit around the Corrib as well. In Britain, as a native, it's only found in a few sites in northern England. It's quite scattered as a garden escape, though, or where it's been planted. So there's a lot of red dots across Britain, telling us that it's an introduced species in a lot of places. It's not one that's spreading or problematic that I'm aware of, but it is found quite widespread as an introduced species. Its native range is very, very small. Apparently this species is often used to make tea. So people dry the stems and the leaves and you can make tea from it. If I have little nuggets of information on how species are used, I'll drop them in as well. So again, perhaps stretching slightly the definition of my grasslands, this isn't a dry calcareous grassland species, but it is a real speciality of the Burren, and it's found in turlock grasslands. So this is the fen violet. So it's really quite limited in Ireland to the Burren, and to wet areas, again, where water levels fluctuate, and typically in turlocks, and also found up in Fermanagh, handful of little sites in the UK as well. Quite characteristic shaped leaves. You can see there in the top right of the photograph, this long tapered, but still recognizable as a violet leaf. Just as well to show you, I'm so familiar with looking at these maps. I love looking at these maps. I just wanted to show you this is what a typical map looks like for a common species. So daisy on the left and common reed on the right. So really, I'll just go back again. Looking at maps like this with so few dots or squares on the map is so unusual. We really are looking at uncommon, rare species, special species. So again, you can see daisy is absolutely everywhere. There's a few squares that are blank. Maybe someone forgot to send in their homework here when they were doing their plant recording, or maybe there's a big lake taking up a large part of a 10-kilometer square. You can see common reed on the right, again hugely widespread, but across a lot of Leinster and Munster, I'm guessing where the farmland is good, the land has been drained, you would have less occurrence of common reed, but it's still a widespread species. So these maps are fascinating, and you can tell so much from them, even the common species. Okay, so back to some of our Burren specialities and our calcareous. This is a calcareous grassland specialist, really, rather than a Burren specialist. It is found quite commonly outside the Burren. Caroline thistle. I think it's absolutely a stunning species. The flowers are the part in the middle, and around the outside we have these golden bracts, and when it's fresh they really are like they're gold plated. It's really a lovely species. So here's the distribution of that species. So like I said, not a Burren speciality, but really strongly linked to the geology, really strongly linked to calcareous soils. So in Ireland, it's found in the central limestone plains and not so much outside. A few coastal sites where it also gets its need for calcareous soils fulfilled, maybe from, calcareous shell sands. In Britain, again, very coastal and linked to these bands of very strongly calcareous rock. So again, these maps are very illustrative of the geology. You can almost read the geology of those two islands from the map of this species. And again, definitely not a Burren specialist and not a calcareous species, but I just said I'd throw in Kaluna, which is our common or ling heather. And here's the distribution map for that species. Again, found often side by side, cheek by jowl with the species before, which is so strongly linked to calcareous soils. And it is one of the great enigmas of the Burren. How do they manage to find what they need to survive in these little pockets of soil when their needs are so different? Again, you can see this species very, very common in Scotland and Wales and all the mountainous areas of both islands. Less common, we'll say, in lowland England, where there's much less peaty soil. Again, back to a Burren speciality and a sparse map. This is dark red hellebrine, a beautiful species that you find in the little pockets of vegetation on the limestone pavement. Again, very scattered distribution in Ireland, Burren and eastern Galway, a few scattered sites in the UK for this. Dropwort. This is a very interesting species. In Ireland, it is only known from the East Burren and a little bit over east of Gort as well. It's not known anywhere else in Ireland. But look at it, look in England. It's really quite widely distributed in England. It's not a rare species. It is if you're in Scotland, granted, but if you're in England, lowland England, it's not an uncommon species. And it's interesting, it's got a lot of medicinal uses. So this species has been used, I'm just looking at my notes, it's been used as a cure for epilepsy in the past, for the treatment of kidney and bladder stones, for worms, and even people have been known to eat the tubers and the roots in tough times. And I would say they were very tough times because they're going to be both small and, from what I gather, very, very bitter. But quite an interesting species given the contrasting abundance and distribution in our two countries. But it's a real beauty to see, and it's a real, real speciality in the Burren. Just, I thought I'd do a little segue into some of the early botanical recordings. I think it's quite fascinating. One of the earliest known botanical carvings in Western Europe is to be found in Corcombe Row Abbey. It's not known who carved it, and it comes from 1210, apparently. Really quite fascinating. The first plant record that we know of comes from 1650 from Richard Heaton, who recorded Dryas octopetala, Gentiana verna, in the mountains betwixt Gort and Galloway, which I take to mean Galway. The next record, about 50 years later, well, there was a couple of plant records from a person called Edward Lude. And then almost nothing for a century, bar one record of dropwort from a John Keogh. And then from the early 1900s, there's much more work. So a lot more started to happen from then, and we have a steady flow of work. So I'm not gonna dwell on the rest of that too much, but I just thought it was kind of interesting how it all began. Just to mention very quickly a few characters. Hart surveyed on the Aran Islands. And a very interesting man, again, you'd need a whole other session to cover this guy's interesting backstory. Patrick Kelly, or Dr. P.B. O'Kelly, or Father O'Kelly, I think sometimes. He was a man that liked to create different identities for himself. And he ran a nursery in very big inverted commas. He used to dig up and sell Burren plants. And in his honor, the white form of the common spotted orchid, it's shown in the photographs here, it's called O'Kelly's orchid. Sometimes called a subspecies, sometimes a variant, but well recognized at the least. So if you have the full white color form, it's in honor of Mr. O'Kelly. He's worth reading up a little bit about. Okay, back to some of the species, some of the key species. This is blue moorgrass, Ceslaria caerulea. And again, look, a very interesting distribution. It's not as tightly, the distribution is not as tightly focused in on the Burren. You do get it spreading a little bit into the Midlands, and you get quite a wide distribution, Sligo, Leitrim, Donegal. But still, it is not a widespread grass. So this is found really on the thinnest of soils, and not coincidentally also made the most diverse. And really it is one of the secrets to the Burren. It's very resistant to drought, and it can grow where there's very low phosphate. So this is a really common plant across the limestone pavement and across the thinnest areas of soil across the Burren. And it's one of the reasons that the land has been farmable and that the winterage system has come about. So the blue moorgrass really is one of the key things that has helped shape the Burren and helped shape the farming of the Burren, which in turn is shaping what we see today in the Burren. Bloody cranesbill, another species to mention. It is not entirely limited to the Burren, but it is a huge feature. It's got these big cerise colored flowers. They're so very obvious and so abundant in the Burren. It really is characteristic of the Burren. It has a much wider distribution in the UK. If you can just about make out the dots on the map, you see an awful lot of them are red. So it occurs as a coastal species, as a native in the UK, but very often as an introduced species then inland. In Ireland, it's mostly known as a native species. And we have some coastal areas as well, but occurs very much in from the coast in the Burren. And like I said, makes up a huge proportion of the sward in the grasslands in some places. Another rarity, kind of a Burren speciality, is the hoary rock rose, Helianthemum elandicum. You can see on in the map there, hopefully, the Aran Islands and the northern part of the Burren in particular are the only places in Ireland that this is found. A couple of isolated sites in the UK as well, so it really isn't common. One of the things I learned recently is that this species has previously been used to treat shingles. So quite an interesting, but I think you'd be hard pushed now if you lived anywhere other than the Burren or maybe parts of North or South Wales to go looking for this, and even still to find enough of it. So perhaps it was, perhaps that was a big challenge. Another species that is a very interesting plant of the Burren, not a Burren speciality, but you do find a lot of it in certain parts of the Burren, is dodder. Very interesting plant. It is the red part of that photograph. So it looks very much like red strings or red thread thrown over the vegetation. It's a parasite. It's stealing its food, all of its food from the plants, the plants that it's growing on. I've made the map bigger there because it's quite, it's another interesting thing we can tell from these maps. You can see in Ireland, this plant is very uncommon and it's in kind of very dispersed and very much in coastal sites in Ireland. If you look at Britain and if you look at England in particular, the dark blue squares are all down at the bottom now, but there's a lot of pale blue squares. And what they tell us from this map is that the plant was recorded in the past, but hasn't been refound. So it's presumed lost. So this is a plant that used to be widespread in Britain and particularly England, and now is very much limited to the south coast of England. So again, these maps and the colors of the squares and the different patterns can tell us something. So this is a species that really is under pressure, particularly in the UK and potentially so also here, and presumably largely to do with changes in agriculture and just how we use our land. There isn't space for this species anymore in terms of how we farm and manage our land. Okay, I'm moving to a species that now is not a Burren speciality in particular, though it's common there, and isn't a rarity, but it is something that's in flower now. And I think it's quite nice to link into things that you can go out and see potentially tomorrow if the weather is fine. We're at the tail end of the season, and so there are not so many things that are on show, but Devil's Bit scabious is on show. It's just such a beautiful species, but in certain grasslands will be just a purple haze, just this light purple sheen across the grassland where you have these flowers. You can see from the distribution map, not an uncommon species. It's fairly widespread across Britain and Ireland. But it is one of the most important species that we have in late summer for invertebrates. It's a food plant for at least 25 species. It's a handy resource. I'll put it there at the bottom, the database of insects and their food plants. It's for at least 25 species. This database yet has to be populated with lots of information because we simply don't know a lot of the things. It's really, really good for listing invertebrates associated with tree species, but we're still learning for a lot of others. But what's important about this in particular is that it's almost the sole food plant for a protected species of butterfly. You can see it there in the image, the marsh fritillary butterfly. And I just thought I'd fill you in. It's got such a strange name, the Devil's Bit scabious. So it was used in the past to treat various skin conditions and types of scabies. So that's the scabious part, but the Devil's Bit. So this plant does an unusual thing with its roots during its lifetime. So in its first year, it has a normal shaped taproot. And in the second year, the lower part of the taproot dies and breaks away, and these lateral roots grow out. So with folklore and kind of fanciful imaginations, that's what gave rise to the name. People thought this was the work of the devil, that the root was changing, even though the plant stayed the same. So people long ago found this bizarre, and it gave rise to this story that the devil bit off the tip of the taproot of this species. So sometimes, yeah, you have to use your imagination. Another species that's in flower right now is one of our orchids. This is autumn lady's tresses, Spiranthes spiralis. It's an absolutely beautiful species, quite small in stature again, rarely over about 10 centimeters, so it can be quite hard to spot at first. But once you see it, you're probably going to see lots and lots of it, because it really is the species that it can be very gregarious. You can tend to find an awful lot of it. Again, it's not in particular a Burren speciality, but you do find it in the Burren. Again, now my map has gotten a little distorted there, but it's a species that has been lost from an awful lot of lowland England. And you can, maybe if you can make it out, it's been lost from a lot of inland sites and sites in Leinster in Ireland as well. So it's a species under pressure due to habitat change and habitat loss. Oh yeah, I forgot this bit. Again, a lot of our orchids are extremely long-lived, and it just is worth thinking about. This little 10-centimeter orchid, when you see it, takes about 11 years for a seed, when it's in the ground, to produce an above-ground plant, something that we can see above the ground. And it takes a further 13 or 14 years for that plant to then flower. So this plant is already quite long-lived by the time you've spotted its little flower, if you've managed to spot it. Like I say, it's quite a low-growing and a subtle plant. Okay, let's switch to some of the invertebrates in the Burren and in Burren grasslands. This is the Burren green moth, and you can tell where it gets its name. Its discovery in the Burren was quite important. It was discovered in the Burren in 1949, and before that, hard though it is to believe, the Burren had been almost entirely overlooked by entomologists. There are various reasons for this, but one of them is lack of train lines. An awful lot of entomology and an awful lot of natural history was done by people taking trains to places, and they would walk or work their way out from train hubs. Also, some very otherwise very knowledgeable people and very experienced people just kind of dismissed the Burren as being important for invertebrates. So it really didn't get attention until quite recently, if you think about it. Overall, for our invertebrates, we now know how important the Burren is. 50% of all Irish red-listed and near-threatened invertebrate species in Ireland are found in the Burren. So that's quite a huge, given how small the Burren is in terms of the overall size of Ireland. 50% of all of our threatened species, our invertebrate species, are found there. So that's quite a chunk. Almost 1,000 moth species are found in the Burren. At a recent conference I was at, so some of the facts and figures from the next couple of slides are from a recent conference I was at on the invertebrates of the Burren. I learned that there were 967 moth species recorded in the Burren. During that conference, there was field work, and that number was added to. So you can add a couple onto that. I'm not sure what the updated total, but just it's kind of mind-boggling to think there are almost 1,000 species of moth known from the Burren. That's 62% of the Irish total, by the way. Of interest to us is the fact that there are some species found here, but not in the UK. It's of interest because the UK has more species than us of almost every group. So if we have something that's not there, it means it's kind of special, it's notable, it's definitely something that might be at risk. It's definitely something to pay attention to. So the Burren green is one of those species. I should mention as well that the Burren green feeds on the stems and the roots of blue moorgrass, the Cecularia. So a nice link there, again, the fact that the Cecularia is one of the real keystone species of the Burren. Again, just to give an idea of the wealth of invertebrates in the Burren, in a survey that was commissioned by National Parks and Wildlife Service in 2018, the purpose of the survey was to look at all the invertebrates, as many as they could, at two sites, Slieve Carron and Ballyogan. Some of you may know those sites. And 1,000 species were recorded at just those two sites. There was two main people working on that survey, but they brought in some other specialists as well. So again, quite remarkable what can be done in a small amount of time at just small sites. Open grassland scrub mosaic habitats and wetland habitats supported the most notable species, and the woodlands were found to be, relatively speaking, quite poor. Just to give you a little piece of extra information as well, the Burren is particularly important for grassland invertebrates. So I'm going to present two things. They're kind of poor quality because they're screenshots, so I'll apologize to the person whose data this originated from. The data was collated and presented by Brian Nelson at that recent conference. So Brian is the invertebrate ecologist with National Parks and Wildlife Service. So he made some interesting maps, and these maps show species that are found in Ireland only, so not in the UK. So that's what we mean by Ireland only. So if we look at the map on the left-hand side here, we can see that species that are found in Ireland only and are grassland specialists are really, across Ireland, they're really heavily focused on the Burren. So the Burren is hugely important for this suite of special species. If we look at wetland species that are found in Ireland only and not in the UK, the spread is a little bit more. So the warmer the colour, the more records we have. So the grey colours are a low number, yellow and green are moderate, and orange and red are high numbers. So for the wetland species, there's a bit more of a spread. These specialist wetland species and these kind of rare, uncommon, interesting wetland species, they're more widely spread, but the grassland species are really heavily concentrated on the Burren. And on a similar vein, and again, also from Brian's data, on the left-hand side now in these bigger maps, if we take all of the Ireland-only invertebrate species, so not just grassland, not just wetland, all of the invertebrate species, and we map them, again, the Burren really shows up as being a real hub for these unusual specialist species. But if we look at vascular plants, so the Ireland only vascular plants, the Burren is important, but so too is Connemara, so too is the region around Killarney really stands out in this case, and kind of West Cork and Kerry. So just quite interesting to look at it this way, but no doubt the Burren grasslands are very important for species that are not found in the UK and not widespread or found elsewhere in Ireland. I thought I definitely wanted to mention ants if we're talking about Burren invertebrates. So Tim King is a specialist in ants, and he spoke also at this recent conference, and he made a very interesting, I thought, quote. He said the Burren grasslands consist of two habitats, anthills and the grasslands between the anthills. So that is definitely one way you can look at it, and that's the way he looks at it a lot of the time. But look, they are hugely important ecosystem engineers, and it can be easy to either entirely overlook them or to underestimate their importance in our ecosystems, particularly our grasslands and our more interesting semi-natural grasslands. The presence of anthills alone tells me something about a grassland, tells everybody something about a grassland. It takes about 25 years of building for an anthill to be kind of visible, to be kind of apparent to us as an anthill in a grassland. So you already know your grassland hasn't undergone big disturbance in 25 years if you have an anthill. But then beyond that, the size of the anthills and the number of anthills can help you to age a grassland and certainly tell you something about the conservation value and maybe the longevity of your grassland as an undisturbed ecosystem. And I mean managed, but not hugely disturbed, not ploughed or not significantly improved for agriculture. Ants are absolutely fascinating in so many ways, but maybe top among that is their relationship with aphids. There's about 22 species of specialized aphids that live only with ants. The ants farm them. They move them about seasonally. They bring them into the nest in winter. They bring them out and attach them to the roots of different plants out in the wider grassland during the summer. They milk them for honeydew, and they also feed some of the aphids live to their own larvae. So they're really fascinating in how they manage these other creatures. Just to mention, some people are kind of nervous about having grazing in grasslands that have anthills, but grazing is absolutely needed. Anthills will slowly be swamped. They can survive for quite a long time with low or no grazing, but ultimately they need grazing. They need an open vegetation structure in a general sense, and are quite resistant and quite well able to rebuild, some of the damage that may come from grazing animals. It's a huge number of insects and creatures that are dependent on ants and anthills. Many, many species have larval stages that need to live within anthills, for example, hoverflies, but many others as well. And many plant species also depend on them. For example, spring gentian, their seeds are dispersed by ants. The seeds are quite tasty and appealing to ants, so they collect them for food, and so they move them around, and so they effectively plant spring gentians for us. Many plant species also depend on the anthills as a dry, warm place to live up from the main grassland sward. So they really are kind of keystone species. If you removed ants, you would lose many other species of plants and animals from the system. This isn't from Ireland, this isn't from the Burren, but I just thought this was quite a fascinating photograph, again, taken by Dr. Tim King that gave that talk, really fascinating. And just, this is a little quote from the Irish Semi-Natural Grassland Survey. So it's a national survey, visited many, many sites, and they recorded anthills. So anthills were found in about 22% of the sites in the west of Ireland. They're not recorded at all from the Mid-East and Dublin regions. It's not to say they're not present, but they weren't recorded in the grasslands that this survey visited. So across Ireland in general, anthills were seen in about 13% of the sites. Now, again, Dr. Tim King would say that all of our grasslands are ex-anthill grasslands. They would all have had anthills. It's just now they don't. They've been lost through management. Okay, just to also mention another invertebrate that really is something that's linked very closely to calcareous grasslands in the Burren. This is the shrill carder bee, Bombus silvarum. So calcareous grasslands are very important for this species. And in particular, calcareous grasslands in a mosaic with other habitats. The mosaics and the transitional areas are often so important. And one last animal that I'm going to feature, which is not an invertebrate, but I thought was worth an honorary mention. So this little guy is a slowworm. And slowworms are just are very, very interesting. They're a real kind of enigma of the Burren. So these are a legless lizard. Look like a snake, but they're actually a legless lizard. They were introduced to the Burren in the 70s, so they're not a native species here. Introduced in the 70s and have made themselves quite at home. They're quite common in the Burren, but haven't spread much, if at all, outside of that. I inquired recently, somebody had said they thought they had heard they had spread. Not that we know of. So they're quite common in the Burren, but haven't spread it out. So they really are a Burren speciality. I have often seen them while working in grasslands in the Burren. So coming towards the last few slides, I think, are these semi-natural grasslands under threat? Yes, they are, is the short answer. We have data that helps us to answer this question. National surveys, no need to worry about the details of this. National survey that ran between 2007 and 2012. I visited over 1,000 grassland sites across Ireland. And in 2015 to 2017, National Parks and Wildlife Service ran a resurvey, visited about 10% of those sites to assess how they were doing. And between those surveys, it was an average of about 6 years between surveys, something like that, roughly. And in that 6-year period, about 1/3 of the species-rich calcareous grasslands were gone. So the habitat had been completely destroyed or removed or replanted with something else, which is quite alarming, obviously. Millennium meadows, one of these other annex habitats, one of these other special habitats, about 7% of those were gone. And for lowland hay meadows, again, almost 1/3, so 28% of those were gone. So what is it that's causing the loss and the change and the damage? Habitat loss due to intensive agriculture. So if something is ploughed and reseeded, then obviously it results in a complete loss of the botanical and faunal makeup of a habitat. But abandonment is also a huge issue. It's less drastic and less immediate, but it applies to absolutely huge areas. In terms of habitat loss, just to mention as well, obviously if quarrying or if planting for forestry happens, that is a direct and severe habitat loss. So the key messages in terms of the threats, semi-natural grasslands, they need management. So abandonment is not good either. They need management, but it needs to be appropriate. So intensive agriculture is not suitable for maintaining the diversity in these grasslands either. Another issue to note in terms of threats, and this is in particular relation to the Burren, is the presence and the spread of non-native or alien species. So I'm just going to mention a couple. Wall lettuce, Mycellus muralis. God, I was working a long time in the Burren before I realized that this was actually not a native species. Appears it is not, but it's generally considered quite benign. It doesn't form huge densities. It doesn't seem to have a large effect on native species. The same can't be said of red valerian though. Centranthus ruber. This is a big issue, and it's really a species that's marching out across the Burren. It's a non-native species, quite at home in our towns and cities, growing on walls and bridges, quite at home on the limestone pavement as well. And it really needs some focus and some tackling. Cotoneaster, there may be more than one species. Potentially a big issue, not over large areas, but quite difficult to deal with. And Montbretia, such a beautiful plant and very characteristic of large parts of the west of Ireland, but not native here, and looking like becoming an issue in the Burren as well. So we need to watch out for these, and perhaps some work is needed focused on these species. So I've listed some of the issues. What are some of the solutions as well? Obviously, farmers and farming, so hugely important. They're the custodians of our landscape. So supporting farmers is so hugely important. Results-based agri-environment schemes are a really key way, and nobody has to tell the Burren farmers and the Burren public more about this. You've been a leading light in terms of piloting and making a success of results-based agri-environment schemes, whereby farmers are involved in coming up with ways to farm more sensibly with nature in mind, but still being able to make a farm income. Education, awareness and discussion. The general public, decision makers, all sorts of different people that are involved in any way need to have access to more information, need to be engaged, need to be interested. Children more than anyone as future guardians of our landscape. But community engagement and involvement is so important. If people don't experience and see, how can they care? How can they act? Why would they? So we really need to foster love and appreciation. We need to value nature and all that it provides for us. And within that, recognizing the importance of grasslands. I think in the Burren, they're not at such risk. They're in this mix of amazing other habitats. It's obvious they're important, but across the wider countryside, grasslands are often hidden in plain sight. It's not obvious that they're of value. It's not obvious that one is maybe more valuable for nature than another. So we really need to cherish the grasslands that we have, the semi-natural grasslands that we have. So I think that is me for now. Thank you so much for your attention. If you're on Twitter, I am at Grasslands IRL. My email is maria.long@housing.gov.ie. And I invite you to go and have a look at Great Irish Grassland. It's a new website. We're just beginning to populate it, but hopefully all things grassland can be found there. And also you'll find some information if you Google NPWS and grasslands. It brings you to that second web link there. Okay, that is it for me. So I will stop sharing my screen.
Maria, thank you so much. That was amazing. Really, really fascinating. All about the grasslands of the Burren and all the special plants. If anybody has any questions, you can put them into the chat, and myself and Pranjali will go through them and read them out. I was struck by what you said, Maria, about the carving in Corcomroe Abbey of the flora. What plant was that? Did they know?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it is quite hard to tell what species it is. Yeah. And it's something I've been into Corcomroe, but not since I've read that. So I haven't been in to have a look at it myself. Yeah, so yeah, I don't know. So if anybody does know that, or if anybody has a picture, I'd be fascinated to see that. But I think it's it's really quite it could be a focus of many a tour, I think, or the start point of a tour.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of the flora. Yeah.
I must check it out myself again the next time there. And something else that struck me, the Mollinia meadows that you talked about in the southwest of the Burren. What is, for someone who's not familiar with grasses, and what's a Mollinia meadow?
So Mollinia is purple moorgrass, not to be confused with blue moorgrass that we talked about, that's so characteristic of the Burren. So blue moorgrass is Cecularia. It's the grass that's so typical of the Burren and the limestone pavements. Purple moorgrass, Mollinia, well, it's the bane of many people's lives, many farmers' lives, and many conservationists' lives in one way, because it's a species that can really cause problems if it's not kept in check, if it's not managed adequately. So Mollinia can grow back quite quickly if there are fires, particularly in peatland areas. So for example, down in Killarney National Park, where there were fires recently, it's a blanket of green within a month or two, because Mollinia grows back quite quickly. But you could end up with a Mollinia dominated habitat after that. Also, if it's unchecked, if it's not managed by mowing or grazing, it can make these huge tussocks. I've worked in habitats where there's Mollinia tussocks up to my knee, up to my thighs, even really difficult to move in, obviously not great for grazing animals. So Mollinia will be familiar to many people, and it'll be familiar as a problem. However, when it's kept in check in a really diverse situation where there's appropriate management, be it mowing or grazing, you can have this really diverse sward where Mollinia is just a small part. And you can have orchids, and it's a very species-rich type of grassland. And it's one of these plant communities that has been recognized at the EU level as being quite rare and under threat. So that's a very long way to answer your question. There are some of these really diverse grasslands where Mollinia is a constituent, and it just happens to be in the name, but they're full of orchids, full of other species. There's a beautiful relative of the thistle. It's called meadow thistle, Cirsium dissectum. Beautiful, tall, graceful thistle with just one flower above on top of a white stem. Really beautiful species, and you see that quite a bit in parts of Clare, and it's often indicative of that type of grassland. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. I'm just looking at the chat here. Let me see. Somebody has asked, Tom Sheedy has asked, what's the story behind the introduction of the slowworm?
So legend has it, well, I don't know whether it's legend or truth, that maybe some New Age travelers, or that some people introduced it. I don't know whether it was intentional or whether it was accidental, but it was introduced in the 70s. Beyond that, and I think everybody says the same story, and I don't know if anybody actually knows the truth, but it was definitely around the 70s. It wasn't here before that. And it's quite noticeable. It's and obviously, given that we have no snakes, if you see something that looks so like a snake, so I everybody peddles the same one-line story for actually what happened, and I don't know any further detail than that. And we all have the same story.
That's the same.
Makes me suspicious.
Yeah, that's the same story that I've heard.
Yeah,
they were pets of some New Age travelers that.
Okay. Yeah. So
they brought them to the Burren, and then when they went away, they left their pets behind.
Okay.
I don't know. That's what I've heard.
I was wondering, Maria, sorry to interrupt, and I'm sorry if I missed, and if you've already answered this, but how are the grasslands in the Burren doing at the moment? Are they improving in quality? Are they expanding in size? How would you say is the status of the grasslands?
Yeah, good question. No, I didn't really say that for the Burren. I gave the overall, the national picture. So no, the Burren grasslands are doing quite well as far as we understand. So the Burren program has done fantastic work in terms of working with farmers. I mentioned about the agri-environment schemes. So the way the data is collected as part of the Burren program, we can see really clearly that there has been great great advances in how we manage these nicest areas, so the winterage areas, so where you have these mosaics of nice habitats. So from that data, we understand quite clearly that the Burren grasslands and all those habitats that are found in a mix together, they are doing well and getting better. It's a slightly complicated story in that in my role in National Parks and Wildlife Service, I have to collect data in a very particular way and feed it back to Europe in a very particular way about these individual habitats. So I have a bit of a headache in terms of taking the data that's collected on the farm level and making it usable for our purposes. So, but that's neither here nor there really. We know that the changes that have been, well, the return maybe to a more traditional style of farming that's been supported as part of the Burren program has resulted in better habitat management. So I think the grasslands are doing quite well. Outside of designated areas, we are still having habitat loss in the wider Burren region. So there are certain areas, and a large proportion of the Burren is designated for nature conservation. Outside of those boundary lines, there's habitat loss happening. So sadly, as somebody put it recently, the Burren is shrinking. People are digging up limestone pavement, and there is habitat destruction happening, and for sure there's grassland mixed in with that. So never a moment to be complacent, I'm afraid. When you have financial incentives to change land use, then some people will change that land use, and if that involves destruction of pre-existing habitats, then that's what will happen. So we still need better protection, and we still need better agricultural systems to adequately to incentivize farmers to keep the habitats that are there and farm them in a nature sensitive way.
Very good. There's a question here from Fenula, and I think you may have answered it in your previous talk for us. So I would say to Fenula, do look up our YouTube channel for Maria's previous talk on semi-natural grasslands. But I don't know if you can answer it quickly. She said, how do you define a semi-natural grassland? Is it a managed natural grassland?
Yeah, I suppose I dived in. I spent a lot of time doing definitions. I think people must be getting bored of hearing me defining things, but yeah, it's a bit of a cumbersome term. Natural grasslands occur really in other parts of the world, and they occur without management from man. So where the climate is somehow limiting, so maybe it's too dry or too cold for trees to grow. In Ireland, if we didn't manage the land, an awful lot of the land would revert to woodland. So we don't have natural grasslands, we call them semi-natural grasslands. So they have a light touch management from man, let's put it like that. So they're managed in a low intensity way. So that's what we call semi-natural grasslands here. And then improved grasslands are those that are managed much more intensively for agriculture.
And would you say the semi-natural grasslands, basically the grazing is imitating what would otherwise happen with wild grazers, for example, wild mammals that would graze in a natural ecosystem?
To an extent, I guess. Yeah. There'd be more chaos, more times when you'd have no grazing or lots of grazing, and it's much more controlled in our farming situations. But yeah, absolutely. When you have low intensity farming, it is the closest we can do while still trying to organize ourselves into farms and entities and make money. It's the closest we can do to simulate, rather than full on rewilding, which is quite hard to do, quite hard to organize.
And one question, you mentioned ladies stresses the orchid takes 11 years for it to be visible, the flower. Would you have a rough idea of the time it takes for some of the more common orchids that we would say the early purple orchid? How long would it be? What would be the age of some of those orchids?
Yeah, I don't know across all the species, but I do know some of the others also take a surprisingly long time. So yeah, I don't know, but that's something that there are very patient people who have done this and looked at this. Well, they're not patient, but maybe they've done very long-term studies. So I don't know for individual species, but I do know that some of the other orchids are similarly long. They take similarly long time to show. But I also conversely realized recently through something that I read is that orchids have really tiny seeds. Like a single orchid plant can produce something like 60,000 seeds. They're tiny, they're absolutely minuscule. And so they get scattered by the wind everywhere. And so actually, while orchids are very uncommon and we don't get to see them flowering that often, I mean, outside of the Burren now, happily in the Burren, they're still quite common. but actually there are seeds in the seed bed in many places. And so sometimes people get a surprise, either if there's disturbance in the soil and there's some space, or, you know, or people change management to a more nature friendly cut and remove, maybe from their lawn or from a park, and orchids start to appear. So orchid seed can be quite long lived and can be quite widespread, but the conditions needed for the orchids to grow and thrive and flower can be maybe not always there. So we don't see them, we're not aware of them.
Very good. Mary, do you have one last
just one last question here. If you have patches of species-rich grassland which are not grazed, when and how often would you cut and remove to encourage flora?
Okay. If you want to encourage grassland flora, then probably every year. Well, it kind of depends. I don't know whether this person means their lawn or whether they mean they own some land out in the countryside. So I'm going to presume we're talking about the countryside, the wider countryside. Yeah. So at least once a year. So some of the nicest grasslands are mown once a year. You cut and remove mid to late summer. Absolutely lovely. The best scenario altogether is if you can mow and have an after graze. The grazing is great because it creates little pockets of bare ground from the animals moving around, and also stomps in the seed if there's seed fallen either from the standing flowers or if there's just been a hay cut taken. So at least yearly, if you're talking out in the wider countryside. If you're talking your lawn, then it depends on what's practical for you. There's a lot of people really trying hard to make space for nature and to let things grow for the pollinators, and then they realize that their lawnmower doesn't cut their lawn anymore at the end of the summer. So it needs to be what's practical. So if it's a lawn situation, leave it for as long as you can, for whatever you can manage. And if you can leave some tall patches, and maybe they're cut every second year by some means, yeah, all the better. But yeah.
Good. Okay, Maria. Well, Mary, do you have any other questions, or will we wrap it up for the?
No, I think that's it.
That's fantastic.
Very, very interesting. Thanks a million, Maria.
Great. Thanks, Maria. I've recorded the webinar, so it'll be on our YouTube